The machines didn't remove the danger. They delivered it. Swinging through the air, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing on a piece of steel about as wide as your 2 feet placed side by side. Not concrete, not wood. Steel, cold, smooth, and slightly slick from the morning fog that rolled in off the Hudson River before the sun came up. Below you, and I mean directly below you, is not a floor. There is no floor. There is no platform. There is no net. There is just air. And below that air, 400 feet down, is the street. Tiny yellow taxis. People who look like moving dots. The sound of the city horns. Voices, the grinding machinery of a world that has no idea you exist up here, all of it compressed into a faint murmur that barely reaches you. Because up here, the wind takes everything. The wind takes the sound. It takes the warmth from your hands. It takes your confidence if you let it. And some days, if you're not careful, it will try to take you. Your name, in this moment, is John Bowser, or maybe it's Patrick Connolly, or Charlie Roskowski, one of the 400 ironworkers who showed up before dawn on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1930, ate a quick breakfast at a street cart on 34th Street, signed nothing, and climbed, just climbed, up the skeletal frame of what would become the most famous building in human history. My name is Jonathan, and this is the Deep Mine Files. Today we're going inside one of the most astonishing and least discussed stories in American construction history. Not the blueprints, not the famous photographs, though we'll talk about those, not the ribbon cutting or the lights or the crowds. We're going to talk about what it actually felt like to be up there. Because here is the thing that gets lost in every documentary about the Empire State Building, every celebration of its achievement. Every time someone posts that iconic image of workers eating lunch on a beam with their legs dangling over the city, people look at those photos and they think incredible. They think brave. They think, what a different era. What they don't think about, what almost nobody talks about, is the isolation. Not isolation in the social sense. These men worked in teams. They had foremen and gangs, and the rhythmic, almost choreographed system of a rivet gang working in perfect sync. They weren't alone in the way you might imagine a lone climber on a mountain face, but they were isolated in a way that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never stood at extreme height without anything beneath them. If something went wrong up there, and things went wrong regularly, no one could reach you in time. Let that sit for a moment. No one could reach you in time. To understand why any of this happened at all, you have to understand New York City in 1929 and 1930, because this story doesn't begin with a construction worker on a beam. It begins with a crash. On October 29, 1929, a date that history would brand forever as Black Tuesday, the American stock market collapsed with a violence that no one had truly predicted. In a single day, billions of dollars in paper wealth simply ceased to exist. Banks began to fail. Businesses began to close. Red lines began to form on the streets of the wealthiest city in the most powerful nation on earth. By 1930, roughly 4 million Americans were out of work. By 1932, that number would swell to over 12 million, nearly a quarter of the entire workforce. Men who had worked their whole lives, who had built things, moved things, made things, suddenly found themselves standing on street corners with nothing to offer the world but their labor, and the world, for a time, didn't want it. Into this environment, this broken, desperate, humbling moment in American history, comes a man named John Jacob Raskob, a financier, a former executive at General Motors and DuPont, a man whose personal wealth was staggering enough to survive even the crash. And Raskob had an idea, an extraordinary, almost reckless idea, perfectly calibrated for its moment. He wanted to build the tallest building in the world, and he wanted to build it in Manhattan, and he wanted to start immediately. The location was chosen, a block on Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets in Midtown Manhattan, where the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel had stood. The hotel was demolished itself, a massive undertaking, and the site was cleared. The architect was William Lamb of the firm Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, and the goal was simple, almost absurd in its ambition: 102 stories, over 1,400 feet to the tip of the mooring mast, taller than anything ever built by human hands. But here's what makes this story almost mythological in scope. The construction of the Empire State Building wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a feat of speed. The entire above-ground steel framed the skeleton. The building was completed in just 23 weeks. The total construction, from groundbreaking to opening, took approximately 14 months. 14 months for a 102-story skyscraper. In the middle of the Great Depression, to achieve that speed, the contractors, the firm of Starrett Brothers and Eakin, deployed a workforce that at its peak numbered approximately 3,400 men per day, not in total, per day, spread across different trades, different floors, different heights. Some of them were working near the ground, handling logistics and materials. But many of the iron workers, the riveters, the connectors were working at heights that would make most people physically sick just to contemplate. And in 1930, those men were not protected in any meaningful way by the standards we accept today. There were no personal fall arrest systems, no full-body harnesses attached to anchor points, no safety nets suspended beneath the work zone. OSAGA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal agency that today sets the legal floor for worker protection, would not exist for another 4 decades. It wasn't created until 1970. The ironworkers of the Empire State Building worked 40 years before any federal law required their employers to protect them from falling. What they had, instead of safety equipment, was something older and in some ways more remarkable. They had skill. They had habit. They had a culture of work that had developed over decades of American skyscraper construction, stretching back to the late 19th century, when the first true steel frame buildings began to rise in Chicago and New York. A culture that treated the ability to move casually at extreme heights, to walk on a beam, to lean out over nothing, to catch a flying rivet in a metal bucket without flinching, not as something exceptional, but as simply the job. You either had it or you didn't, and if you didn't, you found different work. Many of the ironworkers on the Empire State Building were Mohawk men from the Conowick Reserve near Montreal, the same community that had already built a reputation across the American construction industry for what observers at the time called an almost preternatural comfort with heights. The Mohawk ironworkers had first entered the trade during the construction of the Victoria Bridge over the St. Lawrence River in the 1880s, and by the 1920s and 1930s, they were present on virtually every major steel project in the Northeast. They worked as connectors, as riveters, as bolters up. They were among the most skilled tradesmen on the site, and their presence, their calm professionalism, their refusal to treat the height as anything other than a condition of the work, set a tone that the entire workforce absorbed. But skill is not the same as invulnerability, and no amount of experience can eliminate the fundamental reality of what it means to stand on an 8-inch steel flange 400 feet above the ground with a 30-mile-per-hour wind pushing against your chest. The wind. If you spend enough time reading first-hand accounts of high-rise ironwork from this era, the memoirs, the oral histories, the interviews recorded decades later by labor historians and journalists, the wind comes up again and again, not as a dramatic climax, not as the thing that finally broke someone, just as a constant, relentless, defining feature of the work. On the ground, wind is an annoyance. It blows your newspaper, it messes your hair, it makes a cold day colder. On the 40th floor of a steel frame with no exterior walls, no glass, no cladding, just open air in every direction, wind is a different creature entirely. It is not annoying. It is adversarial. It comes in gusts that arrive without warning, from angles you don't expect, with a force that can genuinely move you. Not throw you, move you. A few inches, a shift of weight, a repositioning of your feet, and when you are standing on 8 inches of steel, a few inches is everything. The physical environment of the construction site was unlike anything most of us have ever experienced or ever will. Imagine a structure in the early months, a low structure 10 or 15 stories rising rapidly from a city block that is surrounded by the full chaos of Midtown Manhattan. 34th Street below is a roar of traffic and noise and the particular grinding, rhythmical sound of a city at work. Now imagine climbing to the top of that structure, not in an elevator. The construction elevators were functional but limited, but often by foot. Up temporary wooden stairs or ladders bolted to the steel. Up you go, 10 floors, 20, 30, and with every floor you climb, something strange happens. The city gets quieter. Not silent, never silent, not in those early stages when the building is still relatively close to the ground and the noise of street traffic still reaches you, but quieter, more distant, more abstract. The sounds of the street begin to separate themselves from each other, losing their urgency, becoming almost musical in their faintness. A horn, a shout, the clatter of a delivery cart, each one distinct now, individual, stripped of the crowded chaos that produces them. And then, as you climb higher 50 floors, 60, 70, as the building climbs through 1930, and into the spring of that year, something else happens. The city doesn't just get quiet, it disappears. Not visually. You can still see it. You can look down at Fifth Avenue and see the tiny rectangles of automobiles moving in orderly lines, the geometric shadows of buildings across the street, the pinprick dots of pedestrians going about their morning. But the sound, the living, breathing, human sound of New York City simply does not reach you anymore. It is below you, sealed beneath the atmosphere of the lower city, and up here there is nothing but wind. Wind and the sounds of the work itself. The rhythmic hammer of steel on steel, the sharp hiss and clang of a rivet gun, the shout of a connector to his heater boy, 40 feet away on the same floor, but somehow already far off in the wind. And beneath all of it, just barely audible if you stop and listen, which most men didn't, because stopping and listening at that height is a form of psychological danger. The deep, low moan of the structural steel itself, flexing almost imperceptibly in the gusts, absorbing force and redistributing it, alive in its own way. This is where we need to stop and let that image settle, because this is the heart of everything this documentary is about. These men, these extraordinary, skilled, underpaid, largely anonymous men went to work every day in a place that no human being is designed by evolution to inhabit. We are ground creatures. Our nervous systems are calibrated for a world where the earth is below us, always, reliably, solidly, where if we slip, we fall a few feet, where danger is close enough to the familiar that our fear responses evolved to handle it. Nothing in the human nervous system evolved to handle standing on a steel beam 700 feet above a city with no safety equipment, and a wind coming from the northwest at 35 miles an hour. And yet they did it, every single day, for 14 months. And at the end of those 14 months, they had built the tallest structure in the history of human civilization. The question that drives this entire documentary is simple. What was it actually like? Not the statistics, not the records, not the engineering specifications, as impressive as they are, but the human experience of it. The weight of the air up there, the way your body responds when there is nothing between you and the ground except 400 feet of empty space. The psychological cost of normalizing danger so extreme that most people would not be able to stand at the edge and look down, let alone work there, for 8 hours, for $1.25 a day. That is what we're going to explore. And it begins, as everything about the Empire State Building begins, with steel. Steel is not forgiving. Wood is give. It bends slightly under load, absorbs impact, communicates stress through sound and texture before it fails. Concrete, when it cracks, gives visual warning. Even rope, under strain, will stretch and fray in ways that tell an experienced eye that failure is approaching. Steel does none of that. Steel holds and holds and holds, and then it doesn't. It is precise and unambiguous and completely indifferent to the person standing on it. It doesn't care how long you've been doing this job. It doesn't care that you have 3 children at home in a cold water flat in the Bronx. It doesn't care that you've worked on 12 buildings before this one and never had a serious incident. Steel simply is what it is. And in the winter and spring and summer of 1930, steel was the entire world of roughly 400 men, whose job it was to assemble, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet, the structural skeleton of the Empire State Building. Understanding what those men did, really understanding it, not just intellectually but viscerally, requires understanding how a steel frame skyscraper actually gets built, because it is not like building a house, scaled up. It is not like anything most people have ever seen or imagined. It is a process so specific, so physically demanding, so dependent on timing and trust and the coordination of multiple human bodies moving simultaneously in dangerous space, that it deserves to be understood on its own terms. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the ground. The foundation of the Empire State Building was already largely complete by the time the steel work began in earnest. Thousands of tons of bedrock had been excavated, concrete poured, and the base structure prepared to receive the column loads that would eventually carry the entire weight of 102 stories above it. The engineering of that foundation alone was a monumental achievement, but it is not our story today. Our story begins when the first steel columns arrive on site. The steel for the Empire State Building was fabricated off-site at mills in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the industrial Northeast, and delivered to Manhattan by rail and truck on a schedule so precisely choreographed that it functioned almost like a just-in-time manufacturing system decades before that concept had a name. At peak construction, roughly 60 truckloads of steel were arriving at the site every single day. The materials were hoisted directly from delivery trucks to the floor where they were needed, using a system of derrick cranes positioned at strategic points on the rising structure. There was almost no storage on site. There couldn't be. The footprint of the building occupied the entire city block, and Manhattan real estate does not offer warehouse space. Steel arrived, was hoisted, and was placed, often within hours of delivery. The entire operation was a continuous, flowing system that had to be managed with near military precision. At the center of that system was the steel gang. A typical ironworking gang on the Empire State Building consisted of 4 men. These 4 people were, in the most literal possible sense, responsible for each other's lives every single minute of the working day. Their roles were specific and interdependent, and had been refined through decades of skyscraper construction into something approaching an art form. There was the heater boy, often actually a boy, or at least the youngest member of the gang, sometimes a teenager. His job was to manage the portable coke-fired forge that heated the rivets. He would take raw rivet steel pins roughly an inch in diameter and several inches long, depending on the application, and heat them in the forge until they glowed a specific shade of orange-yellow. The color mattered. Too cool, and the rivet wouldn't deform properly when driven. Too hot, and it would be too soft to hold. The heater boy learned to read that color the way a chef learns to read the surface of a searing piece of meat. It was entirely tactile and visual knowledge, earned through repetition and the occasional ruined rivet. Then came the catch boy or catcher. When a rivet was ready, the heater boy would pull it from the forge with tongs and, in a single practice motion, throw it, not hand it, throw it, through the air, across whatever distance separated the forge from the connection point, which might be 10 feet, or it might be 30 or 40 feet, and which was always in open air, at whatever height the gang was working. The catcher would be waiting with a metal cone, sometimes described as a tin can, held in one hand. His job was to catch the incoming rivet in that cone and transfer it immediately it was still glowing, still burning hot, to the correct position for the riveter. The timing of this exchange was measured in seconds. A rivet that missed the can fell, straight down, glowing orange, tumbling through hundreds of feet of open air before it hit either the debris netting if one was present, or the ground, or in this happened something or someone it was not supposed to hit. Workers on lower floors, passers-by on the street, vehicles. A hot rivet falling from the 40th floor of a steel frame is not a minor inconvenience. It is a projectile. But assuming the catch was clean, and the catchers made clean catches with the regularity of professional athletes, because that is essentially what they were, the rivet was then positioned in the pre-drilled hole by the bucker-up. The bucker-up placed a heavy steel bar against the tail of the rivet from one side, holding it firmly in place, and then the riveter went to work. The riveter was typically the most experienced member of the gang. Using a pneumatic hammer, a loud, violent tool that delivered thousands of impacts per minute, he would drive the protruding end of the rivet down and out, deforming it into a rounded head that locked the joint permanently. The rivet, still hot and malleable from the forge, would fill the hole perfectly and then harden as it cooled, contracting slightly and drawing the steel members together with tremendous force. This process, heat, throw, catch, position, drive, took roughly a minute per rivet when the gang was working well. On a good day, a single gang might drive several hundred rivets. The Empire State Building required approximately 7 million rivets in total. 7 million. Each one thrown through the air. Each one caught by a human hand in a metal cone. Each one driven into steel at whatever height the work happened to be on that particular day. Now take that image, that precise, rhythmic, almost beautiful process, and place it where it actually occurred. Not in a factory. Not on a low platform with guardrails and solid footing. Place it on a beam 4 inches wide, or 8 inches wide, on a good connection point, at a height of 300, 400, 500, 600 feet above the street. Place the heater boy's forge on a temporary platform cantilevered off the structural steel with chains, swaying slightly in the wind. Place the catcher 30 feet away, across a gap with nothing below it but air, crouching, or standing or leaning against a vertical column, because there is nothing else to lean against. Place the riveter with his pneumatic hammer, a tool that vibrates so intensely it will numb your arms after an hour of continuous use, balanced on a beam, legs straddling the steel if he's lucky, hanging off a connection if he's not, driving rivets into joints at angles that require him to twist his body in ways that would challenge a gymnast, all while that pneumatic hammer is hammering its way through his hands and arms and shoulders. This is the work, not as metaphor, not as dramatic license. This is what the historical record documents. This is what the photographs show, taken by Charles Clyde Ebbets and Louis Hine and others who somehow managed to get themselves out onto those beams with their cameras to capture what was happening. And what was happening was this: ordinary men, in ordinary clothes, work boots and dungarees and caps, not helmets, not high-visibility vests, not fall arrest harnesses, were building the world's tallest structure by standing on its outermost edges and reaching beyond them. The photographs deserve special attention because they have become so iconic that people sometimes forget to actually look at them. The most famous is probably the one you already know. 11 workers eating lunch on a beam, legs dangling. New York City spread out beneath and behind them. Taken in September 1932, during construction of a different Building 30 Rockefeller Plaza, but capturing perfectly the visual reality of ironwork in this era. The men are relaxed. Some are talking. One appears to be lighting a cigarette. None of them are holding on to anything. When most people see that photograph, they experience a kind of retrospective vertigo, a queasy, thrilling sense of not quite believing what they're looking at. The height is abstract but undeniable. The casualness of the men is simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. But here's what that photograph doesn't show you, what no photograph can show you: the wind, the constant, insistent, directional pressure of wind at that altitude, which makes the casual posture of those men not a sign that they've forgotten where they are, but a sign that they have so completely mastered their relationship with that environment that they can sit in it the way you sit in a comfortable chair, not because it is comfortable, but because they have spent years training their bodies to be still in conditions that would cause an untrained person to grip and shake and freeze. That mastery was real. It was earned. It was the product of an apprenticeship culture that started young men low and moved them higher over years of accumulated experience. You didn't start your first day on the top floor. You started at the bottom and you worked your way up, literally and figuratively, until your body had developed the specific, learned calm that high-altitude ironwork required. But mastery is not perfection, and the Empire State Building was not a controlled environment. The pace of construction introduced variables that even the most experienced ironworkers had never encountered at quite this scale or speed. Consider this: the steel frame of the Empire State Building rose at an average rate of approximately 4.5 floors per week during peak construction. 4.5 floors per week. That is not a typo. That is the documented historical record, and it remains one of the most staggering construction achievements in American history. To maintain that pace, everything had to move, constantly. The material delivery system, the hoisting operation, the concrete pours, the masonry crews following behind the steel gangs, all of it had to function as a single coordinated machine with almost no tolerance for delay. And when you are moving that fast, when the entire rhythm of the operation depends on maintaining pace, the natural human tendency to pause and reassess, to look at a situation and say, wait, something feels wrong here, becomes a tendency that the system actively works against. Not through malice. Nobody was telling the workers to ignore their instincts, but pace creates its own pressure. When 400 men are depending on the steel gang to complete a connection so the next piece can be hoisted, and the crane operator is waiting, and the foreman is checking his watch, the subtle psychological pressure to keep moving rather than stop and reconsider is enormous. This is one of the least visible and most dangerous features of large-scale, high-speed construction. The momentum of the operation itself becomes a kind of hazard. Not the wind, not the height, not any single physical threat. The hazard is the rhythm. The hazard is the pace that makes stopping feel like failure. And the workers of the Empire State Building were not in a position to afford failure in any sense of the word. Remember the context. It is 1930. The Great Depression has been underway for roughly a year. Unemployment in New York City is climbing toward numbers that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The bread lines on the streets below, those same streets visible from the beams where the iron workers balanced, were real. The men standing in them were not abstractions. Some of them were neighbors. Some of them were brothers or cousins or former workmates who had been laid off elsewhere and were now waiting for something to break their way. The iron workers on the Empire State Building earned between $10 and $15 for a full day's work, depending on their trade and experience. In the context of the Depression, this was not a small sum. The average American industrial wage in 1930 was closer to $17 per week. The iron workers were earning, on good days, close to that in a single shift. But the work was available only as long as they performed. There was no shortage of desperate men who would take their place. The foremen and contractors knew this. The workers knew this. And this knowledge, this awareness that the job was a lifeline, and that lifelines could be cut, was another invisible pressure layered on top of the wind and the height and the pace. You did not complain. You did not hesitate too visibly. You did not let fear show in a way that might give your foreman a reason to look at you differently. You arrived on time. You climbed when you were told to climb, and you did the work. This is not cynicism. This is documented social reality. The oral histories of iron workers from this period return to it consistently, the awareness that being seen as afraid or slow or uncertain carried professional consequences that in the context of 1930 could mean genuine hardship for your family. So the men climbed. And as the building climbed with them, floor by floor, week by week, through the spring and summer of 1930, the height increased, and the isolation intensified, and the wind got stronger, and the work continued at 4.5 floors per week. There is a specific phenomenon that workers describe when talking about heights that cross a certain threshold. It doesn't have a precise clinical name, but it is well documented in the literature of high-altitude work and extreme mountaineering and bridge construction. It is the moment when the ground ceases to feel real. Below a certain height, 40, 50 floors, depending on the individual, you still feel connected to the ground even when you can't touch it. Your nervous system maintains a kind of anchor, a sense that the ground is near, that it is accessible, that it is still part of your immediate environment, even if it's below you. Above that threshold, something shifts. The ground stops being the floor and starts being an abstraction, a visual fact rather than a physical reality. You can see it, but your body no longer believes in it the way it normally does. And into that perceptual gap, that disconnection between what your eyes tell you and what your body has always assumed, steps something else. Not necessarily panic, not necessarily fear, in the acute sense that makes your hands sweat and your heart race. Something quieter and in some ways more insidious than fear. A kind of profound existential aloneness. A recognition that you are in a place where the normal rules of human physical existence do not apply. Where the ground which has supported every step you have ever taken is no longer part of your story. Where you are, in the most literal possible sense, on your own. The iron workers of the Empire State Building lived in that place for months. They ate lunch there, they argued with each other there, they cracked jokes and complained about the foreman and thought about what they were going to do after work and whether the Yankees were going to have a decent season. And they balanced on their beams, and they caught their rivets, and they built their floors above the city and below the clouds, and every single day they did it. They were doing it in a place where, if something went wrong, no one could reach them in time. On May 1st, 1931, the Empire State Building was no longer a construction site. It was something else entirely. Finished. Lit. Presented to the world as proof that even in the middle of collapse, even in the middle of uncertainty, something permanent could still be built. From the street it must have looked effortless. A vertical line of steel and stone rising cleanly into the sky, symmetrical, complete. Silent in the way finished things are silent, giving no indication of the noise, the strain, the constant negotiation that brought them into existence. People gathered below and looked up. They saw height. They saw scale. What they did not see, what no one on the ground could see, was how little had separated that finished form from failure every single day it was being built. Because the building did not rise all at once. It rose one decision at a time, one step, one shift of weight, one hand reaching where it needed to go without hesitation. Every floor that now feels solid was once incomplete. Every beam that now feels permanent was once a narrow edge in open air. And every man who worked on it had to accept something that most people never have to think about, that there would be moments where nothing existed beneath them but distance. When the project ended, the men did not stay. They didn't stand in the street and admire what they had done. Most of them were already moving on to the next structure, the next contract, the next place where steel would need to be placed in space before it could become something stable. That was the nature of the work. You built, you left, and what you built stayed behind, detached from the experience of building it. Some carried injuries with them, hands that no longer closed the same way, joints that absorbed too many micro-corrections over too many months, bodies that had adapted to conditions they were never meant to endure for that long. Others carried something less visible, a memory of height that never fully left, a recalibration of what danger feels like. Once you have spent months standing where there is nowhere to stand, the ground does not feel the same when you return to it. The official records say 5 men died during the construction. 5 names attached to a structure that would become one of the most recognized in the world, but numbers by themselves are incomplete. They do not capture the accumulated cost of working every day in a place where attention could never fully relax. And they do not capture the simple, persistent reality that defined the entire project, that at the highest levels of the building, help was not immediate. It was distant, sometimes impossibly distant. If something went wrong up there, no one could reach you in time, not because they didn't want to, not because they weren't trying, but because the distance itself made it real. The height turned time into something physical. Every second stretched by the space between where you were and where help had to come from. Over the decades that followed, construction changed. Slowly. Not all at once. Not because of a single building. but because of an accumulation of buildings like this one, an accumulation of risk, of injury, of experience that eventually forced a different approach. Today, no worker would be allowed to do what these men did. Not without secured platforms. Not without systems designed to catch a fall before it becomes final. Those systems exist now because once they didn't. Because there was a time when the only thing between a worker and the ground was his own balance. And yet, despite everything that has changed, something remains difficult to translate. Something that doesn't fit into safety regulations or engineering diagrams. The experience itself. What it felt like to be there. Imagine it for a moment. Not as an idea, as a place. You are standing on a beam. Narrow, cold, slightly uneven under your boots. There is no railing, no platform extending beyond it, just the steel and the space around it. The city is below you, but it no longer feels like a place you belong to. It feels distant, flattened, almost quiet. The wind moves around you not in one direction, but shifting, unpredictable, pressing and releasing without warning. Your body adjusts constantly. Small corrections you don't think about. Weight shifting. Balance recalibrating. Every movement matters, even when it doesn't feel like it does. And then there is the silence. Not complete silence, but a different kind. A separation from the noise below. Up there, you are removed from everything that usually defines where you are, and in that removal, something becomes clear. You are alone, not metaphorically, physically, completely. There is no immediate help, no instant correction, no system waiting to intervene if something fails. There is only what you do next. That is the part that rarely gets remembered. Not the height, not the speed, not even the scale, but the fact that the entire structure was built by people operating in that condition, every day, for months. There is a photograph taken during the construction. A man sitting on a beam, resting, not performing for the camera, not trying to demonstrate anything, just existing in that space. Comfortable in a place that should not allow comfort. That image stays with people because it doesn't look like what it is. It looks calm, controlled, almost ordinary, and that is what makes it powerful. Because the extraordinary part is hidden, the cost of that calm is invisible. The Empire State Building still stands. It has outlived the men who built it. Outlived the era that produced it, outlived the conditions that made its construction possible in that exact way. People visit it now. They go to the top. They look out. They feel the wind for a few minutes. They take photos. And then they go back inside, back to something stable, something protected, something finished. But the building was not always finished. There was a time when it existed only as steel in open air, a structure that had to be completed before it could support itself, a place where the act of building it required standing ahead of what already existed. That is what these men did. They moved forward into something that wasn't there yet, step by step, beam by beam, creating the ground beneath them as they worked. They built one of the greatest structures in history. They built it faster than anyone thought possible. They built it in conditions that modern construction would not allow. And most of the time, they built it while standing on almost nothing. Not on solid floors, not on completed levels, but on narrow lines of steel suspended in space. On the quiet, constant awareness that one mistake would not be corrected. The building remains permanent. Recognized, celebrated, but the experience of building it exists only in fragments, in photographs, in partial accounts, in the physical memory of a kind of work that no longer exists in that form. And maybe that is the real legacy, not just the structure itself, but what it reveals about the limits people are willing to approach when building something that did not exist before.